So what I would suggest to you is that any area in your life where you're masterful or you're skillful and good, you're an expert in something, you're able to make fine distinctions. And you've spent years making these distinctions. Now, what's different though about this episode and what I'm teaching you now is that even though in your life you have subconsciously and implicitly been using the technique of making distinctions, you've done this throughout school, you've done this throughout university and in your work and so on, with your hobbies, even with your entertainment, you've been doing this. With music, you've been doing this. With sports, you've been doing this. And in many other domains, you've been doing this, but you've been doing it unconsciously. And the difference now is that I'm going to teach you how to do this explicitly. So that now when you go into a new situation, you're going to have in the back of your mind this memory of this conversation that we've had, this lesson that you're learning today, and you're going to remember like, oh, now that I'm going to this situation, I can set an intention because I know this is like a learning situation I'm going into, and I want to rapidly learn this thing and to really master it consciously now, not unconsciously. And now you can explicitly use this technique of making distinctions. So the way this technique works is that, of course, you've used it, like I said, in many areas of your life and many times in your life. But the difference now is that when you go into this new situation, or it could be an old situation that you're still working on mastering, you go into this situation and now you actually set the intention, the explicit intention of making distinctions, recognizing that that is what learning is about, is making these distinctions. And so you will actually go into the situation and you will specifically look for contrasts and differences between different elements and components of whatever field you're studying or trying to master. And you will notice that now that you're doing it explicitly, consciously, with intention, you're deliberately asking questions that try to highlight differences between the different elements, and you're actively looking for those differences. You will see that you learn to spot the differences much faster, and the whole process will just be much more clear, explicit, and conscious than it ever was before. And in this way, you're going to be able to learn deeper and much more rapidly. That's my claim. And one of the techniques you're going to be using to do this is you're going to be specifically trying to amplify contrasts and differences between things that you're studying or trying to learn. So for example, let's take the example of shopping for a car. Normally, a person shops for a car. He or she just goes to the dealership, walks around, looks at different models, maybe asks to see the interior, maybe takes one for a test drive that he likes, something like that, right? It's sort of an unconscious, lazy process. But if you're going to apply this method of making intentional distinctions, doing this consciously, what you're going to do is you're going to go into the dealership and your mind is going to be focused with that intention of drawing contrasts between all of your different options. So now, every time you're looking at a car, you're going to be actually comparing, you're going to be asking yourself that question of like, well, how is that model different from this model? Or how are they the same? Both of these questions are very powerful questions. How are they different and how are they the same? Really, it's the same question, just being asked sort of in the inverse. Because by seeing how they're the same, you see how they're not different. Or by seeing how they're different, you're seeing how they're not the same. You see just inverses of each other. Sort of like a concave and convex. So when you're talking to a dealer, you can then actually consciously ask the person who's showing you the car, specifically, what's the difference? Like, well, what's the difference between the tires on these two cars? And what's the difference between the engines? And what's the difference about their interior? And what's the difference in terms of their price? What's the difference in terms of their financing? What's the difference in terms of the warranty? What's the difference in terms of the different brands? That might be a Toyota. This might be a Mercedes or something, and you're comparing them. And I mean, you would have been doing this anyways. It's just that you would have been doing it unconsciously, sloppily, less masterfully. And therefore, it simply would have taken you a lot more time to actually learn all these distinctions. And therefore, you would have been making poorer choices. Probably you would have bought a less than optimal car for you. And then through that process, of trial and error, of course, you learn to make these distinctions anyways. You've been doing it your whole life. But here you're just making the process more conscious. And towards this end, I actually have I'm going to give you 2 exercises that I want you to try to actually do. 2 sort of homework assignments, because this is a very sort of hands-on and practical teaching. This is not a very abstract, theoretical, metaphysical discussion. This is pretty hands-on type of stuff. The thing you have to understand about distinctions is that to actually draw a distinction, first of all, there are many degrees of drawing a distinction. You can draw a mild distinction, or you can draw a really sharp one. You can have a vague notion of a distinction or a very clear notion of a distinction. And it's almost like carving a groove into a stone. Like if we have a stone tablet and I just give you a knife and you just sort of chisel at it, scrape away at it, you might carve a little bit of it, but you're going to carve a very faint groove. It'll be maybe a hairline groove in this stone. But if you keep doing it over and over and over again, you can chisel through that stone a really deep groove. You see, and so that's sort of like what making a distinction is like inside your own mind. And so when you're doing it consciously with intention, deliberately asking these questions and trying to compare and contrast things, then you're deliberately, it's like taking a knife and just running it through that groove over and over and over and over and over again many times until that distinction becomes very clear in your mind. See? And if you notice any human being who's masterful at anything, whether it's art, entertainment, sports, film, video games, combat, martial arts, military strategy, business, marketing, relationships, spirituality, psychology, philosophy, mathematics, science, physics, biology, whatever they're an expert in, they are so masterful precisely because they have so much experience drawing these very fine distinctions.